Good afternoon and welcome to CFA UK's International Women's Day event. I'm Aaron Kelschker, a volunteer on CFA UK's Inclusion and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee, and I'm extremely glad to facilitate this necessary and pressing conversation. As many of you may have followed, the theme this year for International Women's Day is Embrace Equity. Equity isn't just a nice to have, but it's a must have. And gender has to be very much a part of every society's DNA. Differentiating equity and equality, people start from different places. So true inclusion and belonging requires equitable action. Despite moving forward with greater numbers of women in corporate leadership roles, gender inequality is still present at the decision-making table. Citing a 2022 study by Spencer Stewart, within the S&P 500, women represent only 32% of all S&P directors. As we move beyond headcount to actual decision-making power, via share ownership or the gender power gap, we find an even greater imbalance. Our presentation closing the gender power gap showcases leading research from ExecuShe. We will follow this with a lively panel conversation together with Andreas Hoepner, Masha Gordon, Sylvia Solomon, Joe Roy, and Marilyn Swinney, focusing on greater diversity and inclusion on company boards. With that, I'd like to introduce our presenters, Carolina Camacho and Katharina Hoepner from ExecuShe. Carolina Camacho is the co-chair at SDGLabs.ai and a leader within Sociovestic Labs. She's previously studied at the University of Cadiz. Katharina Hoepner is the head of impact at ExecuShe and studied at the University of Freiburg. Through the course of our presentation, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A box, and we'll look to address them in the panel. With that, it's over to you, Carolina and Katharina. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Well, thanks so much for having ExecuShe in this event. I'd like to start with a headline from Fortune about a study led by ExecuShe. According to our study, women executives only control 1% of shares among the biggest American companies, and sometimes even less. In top American companies, for top executives, the headcount ratio is 3 men for every woman. However, headcount is not equivalent to power. For that reason, we want to clarify that the difference between management and decision-making. And we focus on those top executives who hold shares with voting power in the company. The men to women headcount ratio becomes 4:1. Although we have 20% women among all executive shareholders, considering the real voting power they hold, men executives actually hold 99 times more power than women. To put this into further context, executive men in the S&P 500 own about $700 billion in share value, while women own only $7 billion. And so how do we measure executives' power by gender? For US companies, share transactions can be monitored through a US government platform named SEC. From there, we are able to know executives' voting power in the company because these shares give them the right to vote on corporate decision-making. We don't really have this for other countries, so we have to estimate the power based on the positions that men and women executives hold, respectively. ExecuShe tracks more than 70 positions for approximately 6,700 companies. In this gender power gap example, we're just going to look at 6 key positions across 3 industries. In the technology, hardware, and equipment industry, the Chief Technology Officer, or CTO, in green here, has 11% of the power among all these 6 executives. The CTO position is pretty much as powerful as the Chief Financial Officer, CFO, in technology and hardware. But if you were to compare this with the consumer services industry or the media and entertainment industry, the CFO is 9 times more powerful and 3 times more powerful than the CTO, respectively. If a woman became a CTO in consumer services, that doesn't mean that much. If that woman became CTO in technology industry, that would mean a lot more. So then we have the ability to take the power in a given industry and move that to companies around the world. Using the technologies sector as an example again, imagine 2 tech companies with the same headcount. In company A, the chief human resources officer is a woman, and the other executives are men. We have a 24-to-1 power ratio. In company B, the CFO is a woman and the other executives are men. We are talking about a 7-to-1 power ratio. This is because normally in tech companies, the CFO has a lot more power in decision making than the human resources officer. We use this estimation approach because, as we said before, no other country than the United States give us the actual shareholdings information for all the firms. In other words, the gender power gap in other countries is estimated in the power which executives roles hold in the firm's respective sector for US equivalents. I hand it over to my colleague, Katharina. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carolina. Okay, let's start with a poll question. So if you would just start the poll question right now, Felicity, it is how much more power in corporate leadership is held by men globally? And we are looking here for the average company around the world. Is it a ratio of 3-to-1, which would be A, 7-to-1, B, or C, 13-to-1? And it is important to say here that we are looking for the average company. As we don't have the actual share value, we can't really do the 700 billion to 7 billion. And even in the US, the average company is not 99-to-1, as the 99-to-1 is usually skewed by the tech companies. Let's see if we have answers already. Yes. So we have 65% saying that it's C, and 30% voting for B, which was 7 times more, and 5% going for answer A. And it is answer B. So it is 7 times more power than women, and this has to do with the averaging. Individually, companies that are doing really good can bring these numbers up. So if we calculated the entire universe, it would not be that good. So now let's have a look at numbers. We have here focus on the G20. This number is clear. Global population is 50-50. And afterwards, you can see the women shrinking. Gender diversity is still 21%. So it's 21% female executives, just representation level. But then the gender power gap is already only at 13%. So this is what Carolina described before, the ratio of the share value in hands of female executives versus share value in hands of male executives. And if we look at the gender power gap on a world map, we see a really interesting thing, and that is that it's not the typical developed country story, because South Africa is doing quite well, Indonesia as well, and both actually are leading together with Australia, with United Kingdom, Canada, and also France. While on the other hand, the countries with the lowest numbers is Saudi Arabia and also South Korea, Japan, and Argentina, all of them actually below 5%. And then India and China are not doing that well neither, almost in the middle maybe, but Italy, for instance, is doing worse than both of them. But we have to keep in mind, like what we call like strongest numbers. This is Australia with 23.38%, right? This is still a ratio of 1 to 4.5. So to really actually reach gender parity on a power level, quite a path to walk still. On the next slide, you see a table. We added here some data to look into gender diversity across different management levels. And first of all, what you see is that gender diversity, so this is female executives on the level of representation, these numbers are always higher than the actual gender power gap, which is related to the typical female positions, right? Such as HR. Typical female position means high percentage of women, but at the same time, usually low percentage of power. And you can observe in these columns a typical pattern. So in this column, this is key C-suite. So these two columns are those with executives with P&L, so profit and loss responsibilities. First column is key C-suite, so the 7 most powerful positions are here, CEO, CFO, and so forth. Gender diversity is still really low, and same here, numbers are almost the same for subsidiary C-suite. While on the other hand, you see here that the numbers are almost 3 times higher on the main C-suite, which are like functional roles such as HR, and also on the pipeline level, which are roles that prepare individuals, right, to move up into main C-suite afterwards. So you really see this pattern of imbalance between gender diversity and power on the other side. I would really much like to show you where the actual data comes from. And this is the live gender data space ExecuShe. Who's interested, we're really happy to provide trial access to everyone. So here you see the different levels of management again, and you could now filter by 70 plus positions, or you could decide to explore the database by industry, 24 industries, by regions where we have a coverage of 50 plus countries already, or by market cap. And I think what is really interesting is this upper part of the database, because we update the data weekly or monthly, so depending on the country. This means that we can really see in live the progress that is made, and we don't have to wait for annual reports. So you could just click here, like October 2020, and in one instant, all the data is switched back to that date. This is now the perspective from the company's side, right? You could also explore the database from the perspective of the individual executives, which would be recruiting, or what I would like to show you last from the institutional investors part. Companies, we have 6,000 plus covered with 90,000 executives, 20,000 of them being women. Institutional investors, we have a coverage of 5,400 right now. You see we have Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and we really actually monitor their portfolios by gender diversity and as well by the gender power gap. Let me show you an example, just as it gets clearer then. So here we look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you see that they're doing really good here. So the entire portfolio is invested in companies that have at least one female executive, right? So the gender diversity is great, while at the same time we see that the gender power gap may be something they're just not considering, because more than half of the portfolio is invested in companies that does not even have one single female shareholder. So we're not adding the share value yet to get the ratio, but no female executive shareholder. With the live gender data space ExecuShe, we're able to continuously monitor the progress of gender diversity, as well as on the head count, as also on the power level for companies and institutional investors around the world. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm looking forward to the panel.
So thank you, Carolina and Katharina. So as we move into our panel conversation, we want this to be an interactive session, so please do put questions into the Q&A box. I know there are a couple of questions that have come in there, and then we can share them with the panel. Also, just to confirm that the recording will be available after the event, so you can always look back at the event and follow up on some of the interesting content that we may have covered here. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists, whose bios I'll keep purposefully brief. So we have, first off, Masha Gordon. So Masha has a strong board background, having served as a chair, senior director, and committee member of various public companies. She currently serves as a non-executive chair of Constellation Oil Services and as a non-executive director on the board of Capricorn Energy, which is a FTSE 250 company. Masha has over 2 decades of direct investment experience in senior roles, including as head of emerging markets equity strategy at both Goldman and at PIMCO. Then we have Sylvia Solomon. Sylvia has over 30 years of investment industry experience on the buy side in equities and sustainable investing. And she's also a member of PRI's Global Policy Reference Group and the Alternative Investment Management Association's Global Responsible Investment Committee. Sylvia is also the chair of CFA's ESG Investing Certificate and also an active CFA UK board member. We then have Josephine Roy, who is the global head of regulatory developments and engagements for payments at JP Morgan. Jo has over 20 years of experience in the financial services sector, where she's held numerous leadership roles. Her board exposure and areas of focus have included the regulatory side, strategy, governance, risk management, and sustainability. And she's worked with both current and prior services to boards. She's an ambassador for the Diversity Project and an alumni of City University. We then have Marilyn Swinney, who has over 20 years of buy-side experience within business development and risk. She's a former managing director and head of UK distribution for Principal Asset Management. And Marilyn has held leading industry roles with Aviva, State Street, Global Advisors, Deutsche Asset Management, amongst other names. She regularly presents on DEI issues within our industry and is an active ambassador for the Diversity Project and part of the core team at GAIN, the group for autism, insurance, investment, and neurodiversity. And finally, we have Andreas Hoepner. Andreas is ExecuShe's scientific advisor and a professor of operational risk, banking, and finance at the University College in Dublin. Andreas is also a member of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, where he's heading the data subgroup. Previously, Andreas served as on the EU's technical expert group on sustainable finance, where he was a scientific lead for benchmarks and co-invented the EU's 2 climate benchmarks, Paris-aligned benchmark and the EU climate transition benchmark. His research has won several awards, including the 2019, 2015, and 2010 PRI Best Paper Awards. Andreas received his PhD from the University of St. Andrews. So welcome everybody to the panel, and looking forward to a very lively conversation about diversity in the boardroom. I'd just like to start with a quote actually from Dame Inga Beale, former CEO of Lloyd's of London. And she stated that many conversations about diversity and inclusion do not happen in the boardroom because people are embarrassed at using unfamiliar words or afraid of saying the wrong thing. Yet she made mention that this is the place where we need to be talking about it. So just kicking off the conversation with respect to diversity at the board level, it helps to sort of have a good definition of what constitutes a diverse board. Just quoting from The Guardian earlier this week on the government-backed FTSE Women Leaders Review, the proportion of women in board roles in Britain's biggest listed companies has risen above 40% for the first time, with only 10 of the UK's 350 largest listed companies still having all-male executive teams. They also cite research sharing that women only hold a third of the 5,200 top roles across UK society. So I guess looking beyond the headlines and given the compelling need for varied cognitive and experiential diversity on the board, I'd like to ask the panel to define what constitutes a diverse board. It'd be great, Masha, if you'd like to sort of lead off and then possibly followed by Andreas. Thanks.
Sure, I will lead off. Thank you very much. I will lead off with the fact, citing a recent McKinsey study that found that the average lifespan of companies listed in S&P 500, so broad range of companies, was 61 years in 1958. Today, it is less than 18 years. That shows you that today, the companies that are public listed companies have to have an extraordinary agility in order to survive in the time when technology, AI, and innovation in general challenge the existing business models. So what stewardship what stewardship bias you need to have for the companies in order to create that agility and innovation? Clearly, it has to be the boards that have complementary skills and that have complementary or perspectives that are not overlapping. So to give you maybe an example, when I started my non-executive journey at the age of 41, I was told by a headhunter who was a woman that I should, when she politely inquired what was my age, and I by that time had over 16 years of investment experience. She politely inquired me what was my age, and I said, well, I'm 41. And she very politely advised me to go and have a third child, which, clearly in the public domain will be not a very PC thing to do, but her opinion or her advice was very much influenced by the notion that someone who was young and someone who was female, with the dissonance to the existing boards, and the average age at that point of a board member in the US was 64 years old, that I would be very much out of sync with the rest of the board folk, and therefore I should probably go and have another leg on the executive career or choose full-time motherhood. Obviously, contrary to that advice, I managed to get on a board journey, and today I serve as a chair and as an ad in the company, having served on companies in various industries. And what I have learned, I suppose, on my journey is that the diversity that we have to have on boards is not only gender-wise, it's the diversity of the age. So having younger board members, particularly in companies that are interfacing the millennials, the Z generation, is very valuable, because these board members bring a very different perspective on the speed of innovation, on the offering, and help to soundboard the decisions that are being made in the boardroom. So to make a long story short, I think we have to have diversity of perspectives. And with that,
So it looks like the connection has dropped there. Andreas, would you like to come in at this point? And hopefully Masha, when she's back, we can bring her back in to finish her final points.
Sure, happy to come in, and probably as many, I thought, oh my God, my connection. From a statistical perspective, boards have a certain size, say it's 10 on average, up to maybe 15, 16. We can compare them with top executive teams. Obviously, boards are part-time, executive teams full-time. It's very important that boards are diverse. However, it's a lot easier normally to get a board diverse and an executive team diverse, because you can recruit from a wider pool. So we looked at this for the S&P 500 just to check gender diversity for both, and we find that boards on average are 5% more diverse, probably owing to the fact that it's easier. I believe that to date, but only about 2 years ago, even the last S&P 500 company appointed the first woman to the board. But the fact that this only very recently happened, it was new to us, it shows that boards need to become a lot more diverse. And to take a wider perspective on diversity, the Asset Owner Diversity Charter knows 15 different types of diversity, gender, ethnicity, and so forth, socioeconomic background. And so I think that that whole range of diversity, also education-wise, is hugely important.
Very much so. And so Masha, welcome back. Sorry that we dropped the connection midway through your answer, but please feel free to go on and make your points.
Yeah, to conclude, I believe that we have to think about diversity broadly, and that's a diversity in terms of age. So having younger non-executive directors that bring fresh perspective, having female directors that bring perspective of perhaps female consumers, to say nothing about, clearly, if we were to not to have the representation of women, we would forego 50% of the talent pool of the world. So that's clearly not something that is advisable. And again, that model that an ideal director of a company is a former CEO for whom it's a retirement job, I think that model is being challenged. And clearly the numbers that you have used from the FT survey, that 40% female population of the, so to speak, of FTSE 100 will change also the makeup of the executive directors a few years on. So clearly, we have shown that the aspiration, comply or explain procedures that Helena Morrissey, who we must thank for her huge efforts on the 30% club, they have worked, and they have worked really well, and they will change and challenge the status quo that was there some 10, 15 years ago.
No, indeed, and you know, there's some really valuable takeaways from that in terms of the cognitive diversity aspects, and indeed, Helena continues to make some fantastic contributions through her involvement with the diversity project as well. So very much playing the leadership role there, and maybe just picking up again on the point that Andreas made with respect to characteristics. And you know, we think about the Equality Act in the UK 2010, and then you've got the 9 protected characteristics there. Just picking up on the example of neurodiversity, for instance, that currently under UK law is classified under disability as such. And you know, Andreas made mention to the asset owner initiative, asset owner charter, with where you've got far more granular detail there. And I think that's something that needs to be very much considered. Just to share, I'm also part of the working group for CFA UK and how we are adapting the CFA DEI code for the UK, and that's a very, very active discussion that we're currently having as of the moment. So thanks very much to Masha and to Andreas for that. Moving on to our next area of focus, which is really about diversity amongst key board and leadership roles within companies. And again, quoting from the 2023 FTSE Women Leaders Review, which has just been released. Of FTSE 100 functional leadership roles, women had the following representation. So as human resources directors, 69%, general counsel, 29%, finance directors, 23%, and chief information officers, 21%. So I guess picking up from there, how can we ensure that board diversity is not simply about tokenism or box ticking exercise? How do we move away from the mentality of one and done and move towards a genuine paradigm of company value creation? It'd be great to get your thoughts, Joe, and you know, Sylvia, please feel free to follow. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. I'd like to state, first of all, that any opinions I share are mine and not that of JP Morgan. In terms of achieving diversity at the board level, it's important to state that one size doesn't fit all approach. To ensure that board diversity is not all about tokenism, a strategic approach really needs to be taken. I would implore boards to think about this like any other business initiative. Firms need to actually think about what their current gaps are, which, as we've been talking about, there are gaps in a number of boards, and think strategically as to how they're going to address it. They need to take a long-term view, dedicate the time, resources, and effort to make sure that diversity at the board level is a success. To move away from the mentality of one is done, it's critical that the board themselves actually help to demonstrate the incremental value that diversity brings to the table. I think Masha had mentioned about, you know, having females on board, 50% of the population, if they are ignored. Think about what that relates to from a commercial value as well for the company. Having a homogeneous board leads to groupthink. We know what the consequences are when you have a groupthink scenario. Diversity on board brings creative viewpoints. Different backgrounds, professional experiences means that there is a lot of ideas that can put on the table that then helps from a company growth as well. Representation is really important. And again, when you have good representation at the board level, the voice of the customer is then taken into account. Voice of the customer translates to better products for the wider population, and then could attract newer customers that are not in your radar in the first instance, and increase commercial value creation. So there is no doubt that having a diverse board leads to a commercial value creation. From a social angle, the future generation, who are ultimately going to be the future customers and clients of our businesses, are passionate about equitable and inclusive society. They would expect that each board or company has a corporate social responsibility, which actually defines what their purpose is. And that is really critical to think about. So value creation, we can measure it in different ways. We've talked about commercial, but the social angle is really, really important in today's world. A board that is diverse, inclusive is very important as well. but they also have to incorporate the intersectionality of our society. So we've talked about neurodiversity, we've not actually touched on the waste part as well, but all of this has to be put into consideration to actually tackle the intersectionality of our society and the makeup of the board. And a board that is equipped in this way can actually deliver a genuine social value creation than one that is homogeneous. And I think it's a board has a significant role to play in accelerating the social equality and creating a sustainable and long-lasting value to society. That's I don't know if Sylvia, if you want to add some more to that as well.
Great. No, thank you very much for setting the context there for us, Jo. And I absolutely agree with what you said with regards to inclusion. And I think possibly, Aaron, if I think about your question about diversity and tokenism, diversity, as we know, generally actually describes the way in which we differ. But inclusion actually describes the way in which we manage those differences to ensure that people are actually treated fairly and equally, no matter how they differ. So because of that, it's actually much easier to steer clear of tokenism by understanding what diversity and inclusion together, which Joy kind of touched upon, means, and its relevance to the actual organization's purpose and strategy. And further to that, I'd add that, board diversity isn't actually about having a percentage that meets a certain criterion. There are several different dimensions of difference that actually matter. An effective board actually tends to represent the community that it actually serves. And its leadership has to have the diverse skill sets embedded that are needed to actually complete its mission. And so this includes identifying the challenges that the organization is facing and using reasonable care, skill, and diligence to overcome them. As, for example, we are directed in the UK Companies Act of 2006. So that's not new. Under the same act, we are actually told as board directors, we need to promote the success of a company. That's another obligatory duty for board directors. Therefore, the board has to have the knowledge and skill set to achieve those coming goals in the years ahead. So having a good policy and the best intentions it's supportive, but it's not enough. We need to commit to a diverse, inclusive leadership, and that must be evidenced by communication, training, and development, which is designed to understand the default sort of behaviors and tendencies of unconscious bias. And then standardized board reporting also helps to ground the conversation. And then moving to the latter part of your question was about sort of the value creating. If you're moving towards a paradigm of company value creation, it actually requires championing diversity at every level of the business. So it's taking targeted action to level the playing field and creating a culture where different perspectives can thrive. And I think this cultural relativity really does matter, because in different sectors and in functions and individual organizations, even in the same sector, they have different cultures. And understanding the sort of cultural norms in a more sophisticated way can actually be very useful, especially when working with groups of several nationalities. Whilst commendable, I must end here, board diversity isn't simply about visibly signaling a commitment to supporting gender diversity, clearly on websites and in marketing literature, and in discussion with stakeholders. Like any other business issue, which sort of Joy mentioned, you need to you can only gauge the success of any sort of DEI initiative by having measurable outcomes in place. So setting those clear objectives with timelines, metrics to track the progress has to be balanced with actually making investment in time, money, and reputation to achieve those objectives. And they have to be continuously sort of under sort of periodic sort of review and scrutiny of progress and also of the landscape, just to ensure that a good understanding of the issues is maintained and that objectives and strategy for achieving these and the language used is actually relevant and up to date.
No, absolutely. Some great points made there, Jo and Sylvia. And you talked about, obviously how we have that cognitive diversity aspect on boards, but very much a large part of that conversation is how we, the pipeline, how we go about achieving that. And just so I guess moving on, I'd like to talk about board recruitment practices as a focus area. And in what has now probably become an infamous letter to the FT in 2021, a leading global recruitment consultant suggested that boards had to contend with reconciling two opposing requirements. So firstly, to improve diversity on the one hand, and to appoint qualified directors on the other. So basically implying that there is a trade-off as such. And following that global recruitment consultant lost clients off the back of that. So the question is really, how much truth is there in the perception that improving board diversity and supplying quality candidates are mutually exclusive? How do you think the recruitment industry can help improve board diversity? Marilyn, it'd be great to get your thoughts and possibly some insights, then followed by Joe. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And it was really lovely to hear a lot about that intentionality and having a clear strategy. We talked about the 30% club, for example. But you're right, it is very much a pipeline of talent. And I know that in Debbie Gilshan's report, one of the 10 recommendations there in the paper that she did on ethics of diversity was really to have that look into that succession planning and board nomination process. But I don't know whether, if you really think about it, whether people go far enough, because ultimately, when you think of active ownership, for the value creation and risk management of non-diverse boards, are you thinking of creating different pathways for candidates to enter into a board? For example, the neurodiverse community is a good one. Interview processes, typical interview processes for a job filters out most of the neurodiverse community. And also we know that there are a lot of women who are probably undiagnosed neurodiverse, from a neurodiversity perspective. So it is important to think about examples where we can highlight where companies across the board, not just recruiting of its employees, but are really thinking and being very intentional about the roles that it needs and how it can actually fulfill some of these roles with a diverse slate of board directors coming through. One example I'd like to share really in the company I worked in before, we looked at the internship level. How do we create a different pathway for neurodiverse individuals to come through? And it was very uncomfortable to do this, to effectively hire a candidate without an interview process. And the flip side is to actually give the candidate a chance, task-based, using task-based approach to give the candidate a task to prove themselves, to show that they can do a project or a particular task or a job. And I think that's quite important if you really think, and that's quite a lot of change. Could we potentially have an environment where candidates can come into a board, and be given a chance to prove that they are able to handle the role, and specifically different roles? Because we talked about that diversity of roles, right? It's not just, NEDs. We want to see CFOs and having more diversity of CFOs and decision making, because we're talking about that power gap, in this case, the gender power gap. But from an intersectionality perspective, the lens looks even worse, because, if you look at the, other diversity elements, disabilities, for example, you mentioned earlier. For me, as a disabled person, I'm severely visually impaired. There are so few people with disabilities or neurodiversity on boards. And there's not enough ways in which you can integrate this community into these boards, unless you think about a strategic, intentional, approach to getting them in. I don't know whether you wanted to add any more, Andreas, on that side of things.
Apologies. Definitely, you've really touched on a number of things there. One of the key things about board roles is we know that a number of times board roles, people are recruited based on the executive roles that they've had in the past. So the senior executives are then basically requested or asked to join boards. So a lot of companies have enormous amount to do, as you said, Marilyn, in terms of bringing people into the organization, but also promoting them into executive roles as well, to give them the opportunity internally and then create a pipeline into future board roles. So that's really key. The intersectionality of diversity has to be considered for us to be successful at having a good pipeline of candidates for board roles. But there are also creative ways. So you've talked about bringing people in without actually going through the traditional interview stage as well. There are conversations being held that you could actually have people come and do some kind of shadow board positions, or even giving them apprenticeship type roles within boards to give them that experience and exposure to be able to then take on to other roles as well. But one of the things I would include as well is inclusion is so important. So when people actually get to that board role, how do you include them to make them feel welcomed, and then to retain them to continue to have those positions as well is really key. Thanks.
So thanks very much, Marilyn and Joe, and some really interesting points coming up there. Also addressing this this aspect of intersectionality as well, and how we do have a mix of characteristics that we need to really consider. When thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just to share, I've put the absolutely excellent report that was authored by Deborah Gilshan and Mark Chambers for the Institute of Business Ethics. I've put the link in the chat, and I would highly recommend the report for those who haven't seen it. It's a fantastic piece of work. And some fabulous insights in there as well. So please do feel free to go to that as a go-to resource on our conversation this evening. So moving forward from there, I just want to focus a little bit on the investor's perspective. As investors, the investment community, stewardship is very high on the ESG agenda. As we know, we've had the stewardship code, which has been revamped. So the UK was the first country to have an official stewardship code in 2010. It was revamped in 2020. And with far more stringent criteria, and so it'd be great to sort of get the investors' influence on board diversity. So even though the investor community is exerting timely and significant pressure on companies to improve diversity, the pressure is often uncoordinated and faces specific challenges. Investors also face the challenge of companies greenwashing and frequently self-selecting data, and make their contributions to diversity appear more progressive, and sort of far more friendly to what, as opposed to what they're actually achieving. We've seen examples of that quite clearly. Oftentimes companies aren't as forthcoming with respect to ethnic or racial diversity on the board, or even the gender power gap, as we've seen. So with that, I'd just like to ask the question, how can the investor community help influence the journey for more diverse boards and all the industry to be targeting more actions collectively to put pressure on firms, and rather than sort of trying to individually try and implement effective stewardship? How much value is there in collective action? It'd be great to hear your thoughts, Sylvia, and then followed by Masha. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Aaron. And you've already sort of, I won't talk about the stewardship code because I think most people will sort of have hopefully looked at that if you're interested in this space. But as shareholders, I think, and I'm talking from as a global equity sort of background, as shareholders, we can actually become more intentional in managing aspects of our proxy voting obligations, which, as we all know, is an important right of shareholders with a view to enhancing our clients' long-term investment values. And so through our proxy voting activities, we tend to encourage investee companies to take their governance responsibilities and obligations seriously. And within that, board composition is actually a prime focus. because even, in terms of ESG, without good governance, it is actually quite difficult to actually manage to implement the E and the S. So we monitor, for example, industry trends and developments to ensure that the shareholder resolutions that we are entitled to actually vote on actually remain at the forefront of best practices. And then we can also obviously update our own processes and procedures to obviously take, appropriately when applicable. And that's actually quite important. So when you get your, when it gets to the AGM or even an EGM, and you are looking through those resolutions, I think it's important to understand that you also have got some authority. And so you can actually raise, these issues for consideration for the board and vote for them. And so what we've done, for example, and I think many firms are doing as well, is actually adopting an ESG themed voting policy, which also helps to commit you to supporting more ESG resolutions. I say ESG because obviously, in terms of government, ES and the G, diversity and inclusion, 3 do actually feature very prominently under the G. And so it's quite important to try to improve the understanding of specific issues among companies by defining and communicating those clear sort of what our expectations are on DEI to the investee companies. And similarly, we should also strive to gather detailed and be quite tenacious about that in getting accurate sort of corporate ESG, or DEI related information, especially when it's not readily available. And we can also set out further to develop positions of being an active shareholder by actually actively engaging with the investees who actually fall short of those DEI expectations. And so with that goal in mind, you can then actually begin to facilitate that implementation of change within the companies and the investee companies as well, and be very, I think very sort of diligent and systematic about it. ESG issues and DEI issues in particular as well, Aaron, as you touched upon, are systemic. And so sometimes they're more suited to coordinated cross-sectoral sort of action. And so, it's important sometimes to purposely sort of establish robust partnerships with relevant and interested stakeholders within the industry to help sort of build these sort of more sustainable financial markets, which is what in the end you get if you have got better diversity and inclusion, influencing sort of public policy and diffusing that sort of industry best practice. So, we try and, everyone can strive to be a member of, various organizations. And also, we look forward, Sarah Maynard has been doing very good work with you, Aaron, on developing the CFA sort of, DEI code and things like that. So if we can actually sort of engage a bit more, that would actually sort of help. And undoubtedly, of course, and that's irrefutable, all board appointments generally should be made on merit. They should be based on objective criteria, taking account, of the specific skills and experience and independence and knowledge, needed to ensure that suitable sort of diverse board composition. But just, as sort of Joe kind of touched upon that as well earlier, as well as Masha, sometimes, you can actually decide and you can look at the board, because that's always something that comes up as a resolution anyway, the board appointments. So look, take a closer look at the candidates that are being proposed and, as you go through and also look at their KPIs and see what exactly it is that they're being measured, what outcomes then being measured, against. And if possible, where there is more than one candidate for an appointment with the required skills and experience, maybe the priority could be considered to the candidate who, if appointed, will enhance that diversity of the board. And this could also be considered, again, in the board sort of succession sort of planning. We also encourage as much as possible when we're looking at sort of the HR function within companies that we're invested in, are those, in terms of how do they search, how do they conduct their search? And actually really interesting is that if you can get firms that are search firms, executive search firms, who are signatory to the search firm's voluntary code of conduct, that's actually a very good thing, because there are certain provisions that are made within that code that actually does address gender diversity on corporate boards. And then sponsorship as well is something that maybe not necessarily very sort of specific to this particular question, but given it was sort of mentioned before, I think it's quite important that we move, especially in terms of governance, from mentorship to sponsorship. So when, whether it's, people with disability, females, ethnic minorities, whatever, when you've got to that position, and when you are engaging with your colleagues, do bring up and mention those that are sort of kind of behind you and people that you think you could actually sponsor, and also bring them, because a testimonial is more than its worth its weight in gold. So that's just something I'd just like to put out there.
Marsha, would you like to share? I mean, as a former lead investor with Goldman and also with PIMCO, would you like to share some thoughts?
Sure. Well, Sylvia covered a lot of ground, so I doubt I will add something different. I would only highlight a really kind of big step from Goldman that Goldman GSAM took a couple of years ago by saying that they would not buy a single tech IPO, a single IPO, which was actually a problem highlighted in, obviously, Power Gap in your report in tech industry, that doesn't have a woman on a board. And I think that being intentional and actually saying we will forgo returns because we understand diversity is important is a great stance, right? Because, and I don't know whether the stewardship officers in the investment world that I listen into the call have experienced the pushback from investors in their organizations of, gosh, it's more important to have the returns than to comply to all the metrics. We have to reconcile the two. I think being intentional here, I love the word Sylvia used, and taking a stance is a way how we push that forward. Granted, clearly, boards worry about the issue, and I've been in many board conversations where the nomination committee chairs worried that they didn't have enough women on the slate coming to AGM. So tackling that, or being intentional about voting for the nomination chair, you actually have a chance to vote against a chair of the nominations committee in the companies that didn't fulfill that, either through your proxy or, if your proxy doesn't highlight that change, doing it actively, I think is one of the better ways of doing it. And again, I think that ISS Glass Lewis have done a very good job in implementing diversity lens as they look at candidate selection and highlighting where that the job has not been done. But I think we have to take some of this intentionality upon ourselves, right, as investors, stepping in my former shoes, and saying we have to take a stance and sometimes forgo returns, short-term returns, for the long-term sustainability that diversity brings into decision-making and stewardship.
Thanks very much for sharing that. And I guess just picking up on one point that's probably been shared by both of you is this aspect of working in the best interests of your beneficiaries, as fiduciaries, and a couple of really striking examples, which I think most people may have come across, is when Engine One basically, together with the support of BlackRock, was able to put two board members who had sustainability background and experience onto the board of ExxonMobil, and went against the board members being proposed by Exxon at the time, and that was very much a sort of a moment that sort of signaled that all investors really have a voice and say, especially if it's in the best interest of all investors. So I think that was very much a key mark moment. And another sort of probably more recent example is again a function of collective action, and just to sort of describe how much more serious things are becoming is the letter written by I think over 30 investors who are part of the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, so IIGCC, who put 17 European companies on notice last AGM season with respect to their audit chairs, and the fact that if they were failing to meet climate targets, it was actually an audit issue, and the audit chairs were put on notice off the back of that. So again, it just sort of highlights that ratcheting up of the expectation that investors have. And again, we've seen a lot of that focus around climate and the two examples I've shared to date, but one can see that sort of agenda very much broadening and across both the social and also the governance aspects of ESG. So with that, we're sort of coming towards I guess the final part of our session. We've had a couple of comments in there. Deborah, it's great to have you in the session. So Deborah Gilshan is with us at the moment, and she has very kindly shared her email. So if people would like to reach out to Deborah, the author of the brilliant report Business Ethics on the ethics of diversity that was written for the Institute of Business Ethics, then please do that. The email is deborah.gilshan@the100%club.co.uk. We have one question which we will be getting to. For people who would like to ask questions, then please do put them into the chat. We will cover them. And I guess the final question from my side is really to talk about the societal perspective. So inequalities as systemic risks with companies, and the sort of role that role models could be leading the example on, especially with respect to DEI and to sort of with the aim of driving better societal outcomes. So I just share a quote from Kofi Annan. And he said that gender equity is more than a goal. Gender equality is more. Gender equity is more than a goal in itself. It is a precondition for meeting the challenge of reducing poverty, promoting sustainable development, and building good governance. And another quote which talks about the benefits of having cognitive diversity, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet/Google, has shared. A diverse mix of voices leads to better decisions and outcomes for everyone. So the final question is, given the key role that corporate leadership plays in driving the economy and impacting societal outcomes, what could and should we expect from boards as change makers when we look towards society's diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges across gender, ethnicity, LGBTQ+, disability, and social mobility, among others? It'd be great to hear your thoughts, Andreas, and then followed by Marilyn. Thanks.
Yes, I'll take that UN frame on, and I think what I'd like to talk about a little bit is the speed of change. Because take climate as an example. So we have a net zero 2050 target that requires a 7% reduction year on year. That speed of change is included, for instance, in EU Paris line benchmark, is legislated. Now, when it comes to gender diversity, and let's take top executives where genuinely the pipeline has to be developed, gender diversity among top executives should enhance over time. And maybe we could have something like a net parity pledge by 2040. So maybe by 2040 or 2050, organizations can pledge to be effectively reach parity and gender equity net of power. So not only by headcount, but actually by power. And that could lead to a speed of change that they would prescribe themselves to. So in Europe, among the retail firms, there is a gender initiative called LEAD. They have a speed of change already included in their pledge. So they are advocating 5 percentage points up within 3 years. That might well work for organizations that are currently saying the 20% mark. Those that are lower would either have to have a faster speed of change or possibly put their pledge to a later year. But I think the very important discussion that boards and top executives all have to have is, if we're real about achieving the ultimate goal, gender parity, then when do we plan to achieve that? So let's say 2040, 2050, maybe 2060 for some that are currently in an unfortunate position. And then can we commit to that speed of change? Because it's the one thing to continue discussion and discussion and discussion. It's the other thing to actually commit to a speed of change and put forward yourself to a pledge such as 5 percentage points up among top executives every 3 years. So I encourage personally reflection on that speed of change that is very important for climate, but I think likewise very important for gender and many other aspects of diversity.
I love that, Andreas. And I guess adding to that a little bit as well is that notion, picking up on this, the risk management, we talked about that earlier. Is it really seen as a risk? And how is that risk quantified when a board isn't not just gender diverse, but diverse in all senses that we talked about from an intersectionality perspective. And how can that be brought forward in a different way? So we looked at that change makers, the role models. And I mentioned earlier, there's just so few role models sometimes. I wonder whether there should be a better community. We saw that with ESG and climate change. Communities gathered together to create that support network. I wonder whether sometimes there's just so little support for the individual, perhaps, who's seen as a change maker, whether a woman or someone with different characteristics on a board. We and Sylvia mentioned, how do we bring along that pipeline of talent? Joe mentioned that as well. But if they're not really well supported and the ratios don't work out, this is one person to so many that they need to support. Now, how can we solve for that? And I think that community aspect, it takes a village to raise a child, for example, but really similarly, what support aspects can we be thinking about, and how could companies challenge themselves to be part of a different community that then can support such change makers to bring that talent pipeline through, that then reflects society and is able to reflect societal change. The FCA talks about the consumer duty aspect of it, but how many boards are being measured in terms of how they reflect, we mentioned earlier, the customers that they are actually serving. So I think the speed of change, but also the aspect of risk management and the importance of managing that risk and having that challenge that it is a risk. And if they don't, do something about it, then perhaps, as Masha mentioned earlier on, this survivability or survivorship bias of these companies may be a problem. And that will have an impact on investors looking at these companies. That was a staggering statistic that so many companies don't survive and have to be agile. So I wondered whether that would be one thing that I would say, really, if we're looking at both the aspect of that change maker, but also the impact on societal change. Plus, in the industry, we're seeing much more impact funds, social impact funds. We're getting more comfortable with the ability to measure and ability to assess social impact. So similarly, I think there's also an opportunity there to start measuring boards and their social impact or value creation in that way. Not just from a financial or non-financial value, but really societal impact. So it would be good to see more of that. I don't know whether you've got any further thoughts, Aaron, on that one.
No, absolutely. And I think it's what's also really key is, Andreas, you talked about timeframes. And we talk about, obviously, the gender gap, the gender pay gap. We talk about the gender power gap, and there's also the gender pensions gap. And, sort of going back to Albert Einstein, the eighth wonder of the world, it's really compounding interest in many ways. And up until the time that these aspects, these differences are basically eliminated, we're always going to have this challenge with respect to addressing aspects like the gender pension gap, which obviously it does have huge implications over longer periods of time. And we also see a similar sort of pattern within race and ethnicity as well. And obviously, pensions differences with respect to that, with respect to communities and across the board. But the gender pensions gap is actually fairly visible, and I think an OECD average I think may have a difference with respect to sort of long-term pensions between men and women at a staggering differential there. So I think there is this knock-on impact which definitely needs further thought. So with that, I'd just like to get to questions that have come in. We have a question which I'd like to open up to the panel. It's I'll read the question as is, and whoever would like to respond to it, please do jump in. And the question is: as many mega tech companies as are still controlled by male founders, which leads to the power gap, does it imply that the environment for starting a new business is not friendly to women? So is it the fact that there's a structural bias with respect to certain industries that sort of disincentivizes women from joining that industry in many ways? And a specific reference was made to mega tech companies. Andreas, it'd be great to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily starting in itself, but the gender power gap results explained by Carolina really show that starting a company and then scaling it for decades and ending up in the billions in terms of share value is something that, at least in the S&P 500, to date, unfortunately, no women actually has achieved. S&P 500 executives who own billion-dollar values in shares in their companies, there's one female, and that's Jeshu Ulla, the CEO of Arista Networks. She wasn't the founder, though, in that regard, and that's 1 out of 40. So if you look for these 40 people, the gender power gap would be 500 to 1 rather than 99 to 1. And so while not necessarily the founding is an issue per se, but the support throughout to start a company and run it for decades, there's probably a lot of lack of support in that structure, probably both culturally as well as procedurally, business-wise.
Thanks for sharing some staggering statistics there. Would anyone else like to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just almost sort of an observation sort of there that perhaps might be insightful. I hope it might be. It's just that I think generally just in terms of the gender gap there, sometimes people from the minority sort of side don't want to put their heads above the parapet because they've probably had to work a little bit harder to earn their elevated position. And so once they've actually reached their sort of, attained their stellar height, in many cases, they don't want to, once they get that top, seat at the top table, they feel that, they don't want to do too much more to disrupt anything because they're exhausted to get there. And it is quite hard sort of getting there. And then more often than not, I think women tend to more suffer from what we call imposter syndrome, far more than men do, I find, generally. And so there aren't enough role models, as you say, in similar positions. So they simply, put their heads down, get on with their work, and pivot from the idea of, justifying why they should have a seat at that table and drive things forward to, justifying that they were the right choice made in their promotion in the first place. So constantly having to prove yourself, I think sometimes can limit the amount of time that is then devoted to, the wider sort of business plan. And also, I just wonder sometimes, we talk about voices and having a voice. And sometimes I think that, we need to recognize that advocacy is actually a skill. It's more than simply having a voice. So without the right training, likely sponsors might, who are great at their day jobs, often maybe feel inadequate or inadequately sort of equipped to speak out and then sort of encourage that sort of confidence. And then on the other side, I find, you find also that, those are the non-ethnic minorities, so training on the other side is that, for fear of using the wrong language, particularly in what is kind of considered to be a woke environment. So that level of engagement, sometimes isn't there. But if you actually look at sort of more sort of mushroom other industries, actually you find that, I think perhaps, Andreas, and I haven't seen the actual work that you included today, but I'm sure if you look at sort of different types of industries, what I call mushroom industries, there are more, you'll find that other groups are very highly represented. So they are entrepreneurial, but not sort of, don't get the buy-in from all the functions that you need in terms of, compliance, risk, accounts and all of that to create the, that large scale business. So, it's just, maybe arguably, maybe a generational sort of aspect could be considered as well. So it's kind of inheritance of, maybe psychological baggage that I think is not as prevalent now because we have seen a bit more sort of activism, so to speak, or engagement I hope that makes sense.
No, absolutely, Sylvia. Thanks for sharing that. Andreas, you've got your hand up, so it'd be great to hear your thoughts. Just a bit of timekeeping. The call is going to get closed at 6:15, as I've been informed. So it will just cut. So I'm hoping that we get all of the closing remarks, 30 seconds from everybody before that happens. And also just would love to take the opportunity to thank everyone. But with that in mind, it'd be great to hear your thoughts, Andreas, and anyone else who'd like to share some thoughts as well.
Yes, just to provide a statistic for Sylvia on current research. So we also study power by ethnicity. And in the S&P 500, semiconductors are actually dominated by Southeast Asian men, much more than white. So there might be a gender issue about that long-term trajectory. And there are separate companies, not only NVIDIA, where Southeast Asian men really in the semiconductor space are absolutely leading. And then to directly stay within my 30 seconds, the point that I'd like to reiterate for the audience is we need to commit to a speed of change. And we need to target gender parity as the ultimate goal, and not just a good reputation in terms of, say, board diversity being better than average. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. Joe, would you like to share some closing 30-second remarks?
My closing remark is that there are lots of diverse quality candidates out there. Firms need to just be innovative in their selection process.
Thanks very much, Sylvia, followed by Masha and Marilyn, please. Thanks.
And in the long run, firms that indulge in tokenism will actually find it very difficult to execute their strategy and very hard to maintain financial and operational integrity. Ultimately, that would actually be detrimental to achieving growth. So do pick based on, collective, competence and suitability.
Thank you. Masha?
I would again reiterate the fact that in order to fight that mortality bias rather than survivorship, in order to get on the right side of the survivorship bias, the companies in the current era and age when innovation is going at staggering speed have to embrace diversity at large. And that's not just gender. We spoke about clearly many other characteristics. And investors have to become very intentional and very much maybe stop hiding behind the proxy voting agencies and take a stance. And taking a stance may include foregoing financial returns in the short term in order to contribute to the ecosystem long term.
Thank you. And Marilyn, finally.
Yeah, intentionality to support intersectionality and measure risk and impact.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank Carolina, Katharina, and our fantastic panel, Andreas, Masha, Marilyn, Joe, and Sylvia, for a really engaging conversation on this crucial topic. A recording of today's session will be available. And I'd like to thank you for joining the event today and helping to contribute to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion within financial services and beyond. Hope to see you at future events and have a good evening. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.